Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal for Reason to Resist on December 21st, 2024. During the past several months, as wars have escalated in West Asia, China's government seems to have taken a somewhat passive approach. The military forces of all the major powers in the region, the US, Iran, Israel, and Russia, have engaged in combat during these past few months, but China's military forces have not engaged in hostilities, at least openly, as far as we know. In addition, China, it seems, has not imposed any formal sanctions on any of the warring parties, despite compelling evidence that Israel, with the full backing of the US and other Western states, is committing crimes against humanity, including genocide. What makes China's approach all the more striking is that China has deep economic interests in the region. It is Iran's largest trading partner, for example, accounting for 31% of Iran's foreign trade. An estimated 15% of China's oil imports come from Iran. Saudi Arabia, by the way, accounts for another 15% of Chinese oil imports. China is also the largest trading partner of Yemen and the second largest trading partner of Lebanon. So with these and other key interests at stake, why hasn't China been more assertive in seeking to resolve the devastating conflicts in West Asia? Now here to help us answer this important question is Ben Norton. Ben is an investigative journalist and analyst. He is the founder and editor of Geopolitical Economy Report. He lived in and reported from Latin America for several years and is now based in Beijing, China, and I'm very pleased to have him on the program for the first time. Thanks for joining us, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Dimitri.
So, Ben, I would like to begin with a general philosophical question about China's foreign policy before we get into the nitty-gritty of its approach to West Asia. As we know, Western governments claim to be in the business of democracy promotion around the world. They insist that they prioritize democracy, human rights, and international law in the formulation of foreign policy. And an obvious example of this, of course, is their official stated justification for arming Ukraine in its war with Russia. Now, let's put aside the question of whether Western governments actually do prioritize democracy and human rights in the formulation of their foreign policy. Let's examine the attitude, broadly speaking, of China to the issue of democracy promotion. It's always been my impression, and I don't purport to be an expert at all in Chinese foreign policy, that China takes a more pragmatic approach and is very clear about this and is prioritizing in the formulation of its foreign policy its national and strategic interests rather than the human rights situation in some particular country or the approach that some particular country is taking to the sovereignty of its neighboring states. And I don't think that China has attempted to portray itself over the years as being in the business of democracy promotion. Do you think that that's a fair characterization of China's approach to this issue, or do you think that the reality is different?
I think it's fair. First of all, we should understand what China's overall foreign policy philosophy is. It is strict adherence to non-interference and non-intervention, period. China, out of all of the countries on earth, all of the major powers, I think it has the least interventionist foreign policy. It's the exact opposite of the US. And in many ways, what China has done in its foreign policy is try to have the inversion of US foreign policy. This is why across the global south, China is very popular. The US Asia Society, which is very anti-China, very mainstream think tank, published a study this 2024 that looked at public opinion about China. And if you look at the map they produced, you can see a very clear trend. China is overwhelmingly popular in the global south, in almost all of Africa, in almost every single African country, in most of Latin America and the Caribbean, and in most of Asia. And the countries where the public has a negative opinion of China are the West. It's North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and also Japan and South Korea, which continue to be occupied by the US. So China's foreign policy is very strict non-interventionism. Now, that means that, and usually that's a good thing, right? We don't want a country to interfere in the internal affairs of other nations. However, there are sometimes some moments, like, for instance, the genocide in Gaza, where people do want maybe China to intervene. But again, this is for good or for bad, its policy is non-interventionism, non-interference. And another key plank of Chinese foreign policy is opposition to hegemony. This is a big part of Chinese foreign policy discourse. Now, of course, since the Chinese Revolution in 1949, the policy of China has changed a little bit. In the Mao period, China was actually a bit interventionist in the sense that, so the non-interventionism is relatively, it's not entirely new. In the Mao period, of course, they were never trying to interfere, but they were helping revolutionary movements around the world. They were sending weapons, supporting revolutionary movements. And in that sense, the Mao period was quite different from the post-Mao period, in which China it's not in the business of exporting revolution. China wants to have good relations with everyone. And as long as countries respect China's core strategic interests, as it puts it, then China will have good relations with pretty much everyone. And China has good relations with many regional adversaries. So for instance, if we look in West Asia, I know you wanted to talk about this, China is very close to Iran. It's also close to Saudi Arabia. China helped broker peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia. China is very supportive of the Palestinians, but it does have relations with Israel. China has good relations with Turkey and had very good relations with the Syrian government, who are obviously adversaries. So China has also played a role of trying to facilitate peace and diplomacy, as we saw in how it helped broker peace and diplomacy and rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So I mentioned opposition to hegemony being a key part of China's foreign policy. In the Mao era, it was opposition to imperialism. That was part of the rhetoric, which in Chinese, they use the term Fandi, which is anti-imperialism. But because of the connotations of Maoism, and the Communist Party of China has moved away from Maoism, and officially in the 1980s, the Communist Party of China took a position that said that Mao was 30% correct. His policies were 70% correct and 30% wrong. 70% correct and 30% wrong, and criticized elements, especially of the Cultural Revolution and some of the ultra-leftist tendencies. And one of those criticisms was also that China should not interfere in foreign countries, even if it's for the cause of spreading revolution. And instead of speaking of imperialism, which in Chinese is the term 帝国主义, they don't use that term very much anymore because it's associated with the Mao era. Instead, if you listen to Chinese foreign policy rhetoric, the term they always used every day is opposition to hegemony, which is 霸权. So when they say hegemony, they really mean what we would kind of call imperialism. But because of that historical baggage with association with the Mao era, they instead use opposition to hegemony. And when China, the People's Republic of China, normalized relations with the United States, with Japan, with the imperial powers, as a precondition to normalize relations, the founding documents upon which their bilateral relations were founded said clearly that they must sign what they call an anti-hegemony clause. So when the US and China normalized relations in 1972, for instance, they signed an anti-hegemony clause. Japan later agreed to do the same thing, which says that both sides oppose hegemony and do not seek to impose hegemony around the world. So when it comes to a region like West Asia, China does not want to be seen as replacing the US as the new hegemonic power. They're very careful about that. And another key element of this is war. You mentioned that the Chinese military has not been involved. It's true. The Chinese military does not get involved in foreign conflicts. China has not been engaged in a war since 1979, which was a very unfortunate 1-month conflict with Vietnam, which really was an extension of the US-French war in Vietnam and Southeast Asia with Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. It was an extension of those wars. It was very unfortunate. But since then, China and Vietnam have massively improved their relations. They're close partners. So China's foreign policy is completely different. I mean, you can't really compare it to not only the West, but even Russia's foreign policy. I mean, I think much of Russia's foreign policy has been in alliance with the global South and in support of anti-colonial movements. I'm not saying that, I'm not criticizing Russia, but Russia does have a more interventionist policy, but not in the way of the US, right? It's not organizing coups and regime change operations. But when countries in Africa, like Burkina Faso or Mali or Niger, when they want military assistance, they ask for Russia to help them. They don't ask for China because China's strict position is non-interference in basically all cases, except for what it calls its strategic its core strategic interests, which include reunification with Taiwan, stability and peace in the South China Sea, things that are directly related to its key strategic interests domestically. Those are the only situations in which China will use the military.
Okay, so let's focus on that's very helpful background to contextualize the issue I want to focus in on now, and that is Palestine. And as before I get to my questions about this, Ben, I want to just provide some useful legal context as well. I recently interviewed the Russian ambassador to Canada, and one of the subjects we discussed was Russia's approach to Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people. And I asked him if Russia had imposed sanctions on Israel, and if not, why. And he said to me, we don't have formal sanctions, but we don't provide weaponry to Israel. That's an important thing to bear in mind. But our fundamental position is that we will not impose sanctions unless they are approved by the UN Security Council. And of course, we all know that the United States, Britain, France would probably never allow the UN to approve sanctions on Israel. Now, at the same time, and this is relevant to our discussion about China, parties that are signatories to the Genocide Convention do have an obligation under Article 1 to prevent genocide. And that article is triggered, that obligation is triggered. It's a positive obligation. You can't simply refrain from helping the genocide to occur. You have to actually take active steps to prevent it from happening when there's a material risk that genocide is occurring. And there's no question there's a material risk that genocide is occurring now. So I think both China and Russia, for all of the merits of their position, their relatively non-interventionist approach, particularly China, I would say as a lawyer, they also have to be mindful of their legal obligations under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. But I just want to offer that as background. And then let's talk about Chinese policy towards Israel and Palestine in particular. So in a recent op-ed in Truth Out, which I shared with you before our discussion today, an author by the name of Shireen Akram Boshar criticized the Chinese government for deepening economic cooperation with Israel. China is apparently Israel's second largest trading partner, accounting for 13.7% of Israel's foreign trade. Israel's largest trading partner, by the way, and not surprisingly, is the US, which doesn't account for a lot more of Israel's foreign trade, 17.7%. Now, on the other hand, a recent report in the Israeli media outlet Ynet, a very important media outlet in Israel, quoted Israeli businessmen who claimed that China has imposed de facto sanctions on Israel by dramatically slowing down the delivery of dual-use items to Israel from China. And according to these chagrined businessmen in Israel, the way China's doing this is by drowning importers of Chinese products in Israel with paperwork, revolving around this dual-use issue. And in May of this year, Derek Grossman of the RAND Corporation wrote an op-ed in which he claimed that China is, quote, burning all its bridges with Israel. And among other things, he pointed out something that certainly struck, I'm sure you and I at the time of the ICJ proceedings earlier this year. He pointed out that at the ICJ hearing in February of this year, China's representative told the International Court of Justice, quote, in pursuit of the right to self-determination, the Palestinian people's use of force to resist foreign oppression and to complete the establishment of an independent state is an inalienable right, well-founded in international law. That's quite a statement, given the attitude of Western governments towards the Palestinian right of resistance. So, Ben, what is the real deal here, in your opinion? Is China taking meaningful steps to protect the rights of the Palestinian people, or is it simply more or less paying lip service to international law?
Well, it's not just lip service. China deeply believes in international law, and also Russia. I mean, this is a key part of their foreign policy. They emphasize the importance of the international law-based order centered at the United Nations, as opposed to the West concept of the rules-based international order, in which the West makes the rules and orders everyone around. So again, for better or for worse, we exist in a particular world in which a system of international law exists, and China has based its policies on that international law. So for instance, you brought up the question of sanctions. Now, there are people who have said that basically there are kind of unofficial, indirect sanctions that China has imposed on Israel, but China would never publicly say that they have unilateral sanctions, because a key part of China's rhetoric and Russia's rhetoric is opposition to unilateral sanctions. Obviously, they don't want sanctions on them. They also don't support the unilateral Western sanctions on Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, the Syrian government that was overthrown. So for them, it's a matter of consistency, right? And I think you're a lawyer, so you understand that from a legal perspective, you have to be, especially if you're a state, you have to be very careful with these kinds of things, because if you publicly say repeatedly that you oppose the violation of international law through the imposition of unilateral coercive measures, you can't say, well, we make an exception for Israel. We can impose unilateral sanctions on Israel. If there were a resolution in the Security Council to call for sanctions on Israel, I think it's very likely that China and Russia would support that. And of course, as you said, the US would veto it. So we're in this very difficult situation where international law exists, and the BRICS countries are dedicated to defending it because they see it as one of the few tools they have to defend their interests. But they also have a lot of problems with that system. This is also why top Chinese diplomats, including Wang Yi, the foreign minister, they repeat every year that they want reform, substantive reform of the United Nations, including the Security Council. China has repeatedly said over many years that it wants to expand the Security Council. It has complained that the Global South does not have enough representation. So yes, China's position is not just lip service to, it is deep defense of international law, because despite the problems that exist, they see international law as the only system that can help in some ways to protect the sovereignty of states. And this is also why China, for decades, has called for Palestine to be recognized as a state. It has always supported every single resolution in the UN General Assembly, supporting the rights of Palestinians, the recognition of Palestine as a full UN member. It's an observer, but it's not a full member. Now, I made a list of the things you mentioned. Okay, so you mentioned also intervention in the case of genocide. This is also another one of these tricky issues, right? Because essentially what you're arguing, I'm not saying this is a criticism, but essentially what you're arguing is the responsibility to protect. But a good case of R2P. We know that the US and the Western powers have used this rhetoric of the responsibility to protect to justify imperialist interventions to destroy Libya in 2011, the bombing of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and the Balkanization of Yugoslavia. Again and again, we've seen that R2P has been used to justify these kinds of interventions. China has been very critical of the whole idea of R2P. Chinese diplomats and legal scholars for decades have criticized R2P. So of course, I do not ever expect them to suddenly say, well, we'll support R2P now in the case of Gaza. I mean, as you've pointed out, Chinese diplomats and official Chinese government lawyers have said publicly that the Palestinian people have the right to armed struggle. They said that at the ICJ. They have said that Israel is violating international law in many different ways, through the occupation, through its crimes in Gaza. They've been very clear about that. But again, because everything they do is framed in the context of international law, they're not going to support responsibility to protect interventions, and they're not going to support unilateral sanctions. As for Hamas and the Palestinian armed groups, this is very interesting. You mentioned this article by Shireen Akram Boshar, who's, little background, an activist who was previously in the ISO, which was a pro-imperialist so-called socialist group in the US that later dissolved and formed essentially became part of DSA, a branch within DSA, a sect within DSA. And the ISO had opposed the Venezuelan revolution in Hugo Chavez, opposed the Sandinista revolution, opposed the Soviet Union, opposed the People's Republic of China, opposed the Vietnamese revolution, opposed the Korean revolution, opposed every single existing revolution except the Cuban revolution. That was the only thing they're good on, but they're still very critical of the Cuban government. They had basically been on the opposite side of every single anti-imperialist struggle, always trying to argue what they call a third position, which is neither Washington nor Moscow was their previous talking point, and now their perspective is neither Washington nor Beijing. They're viciously opposed to the Communist Party of China. They make that very clear. They support Ukraine, they claim that they don't support NATO, but they do support Ukraine, which means they're objectively on the same side of NATO. And the author of this article criticizing China over Palestine, Shireen Akram Boshar, this US writer, she openly supported the overthrow of the Syrian government, which she called the Syrian revolution. She's objectively allied with Israel in Syria. And she wrote another article soon after publishing this article criticizing China. She wrote an article praising the overthrow of the Syrian government, which was a key part of the axis of resistance against Israeli colonialism. So this kind of politics is infantile. They almost are always on the same side of imperialism, but they try to make left-sounding rhetoric to justify being allied with imperialism in Ukraine, in Syria, against Iran, against China, against Russia, against Venezuela. So that's about the author and the perspective that she's writing from. As for the specific talking points, I'll go through a few of them. First of all, China's relations to the Palestinian struggle. Of course, in the Mao era, as I mentioned, China, it has always emphasized non-interventionism, but China was exporting revolution, as you could say. That's the term people use, right? In the Mao era, China was not opposed to exporting revolution. China did provide weapons and military support to revolutionary struggles, including in Palestine. And George Habash, for instance, the leader of the PFLP, and then also later the DFLP, because there was a split over it's very complicated, the Sino-Soviet split and revisionism, anti-revisionism, that history is too complicated to get into, but it also happened within Palestine. The point is that China had been providing military support, weapons to Palestinian revolutionary movements, and George Habash, the leader of the PFLP, had praised China, calling China one of the greatest friends of the Palestinian people. Now, I mentioned that after Mao died in 1976, Deng Xiaoping rose to power in 1978 and had the reform and opening up, and China changed some of its policies, and since then it has not been involved in what it calls exporting revolution. China says that clearly. If you listen to Chinese diplomats, they say, we do not export revolution. Instead, China wants to promote peace, diplomacy, peaceful resolution of disputes. And again, for better or for worse, in the case of Palestine, a lot of people would like it to see China providing military support, but this is a strict policy everywhere. In Ukraine as well. There's all these Western reports saying that China is providing dual-use equipment to the Russian military, but China's official position is peaceful resolution of all disputes. China and Brazil have proposed peace talks and peace proposals to try to end the proxy war in Ukraine. This is China's foreign policy. That's how it goes. In terms of the Palestinian movements, China has been very supportive politically and diplomatically. So, for instance, if you look at a map of countries around the world that recognize Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups as a so-called terrorist organization, it's the West and their allies. So it's North America, Europe, Australia, also a few regional allies like Egypt. China and Russia, by the way, do not recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization. They both have formal diplomatic relations with Hamas. In fact, China recognized when Hamas won the election in Gaza, they recognized Hamas as the legitimate government of Gaza. This year, in 2024, China even sponsored peace talks featuring leaders of all of the different Palestinian groups who came here to Beijing, and they sat down together and signed an important historic agreement that called for a Palestinian unity government against Israeli colonialism. Now, there are people who criticize China for this because it included the PA, Palestinian Authority, including, Abu Mazen, and rightfully, Abbas has been a genuine traitor to the Palestinian people. He has collaborated with the Israeli authorities. But again, this is one of these problems when you have to think of perspective. You're a lawyer, so you would understand that you have to think of these issues from the perspective of an activist and the perspective of a state. If you become a diplomat, your responsibilities are very different. And you have to operate within an existing international legal framework. And the reality is that China and Russia and Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela and Bolivia, all of these countries that have been very supportive of the Palestinians, they all have recognized Palestine as a state formally. About half of UN member states, a little over half, have recognized Palestine formally as a member state. And actually, it's well over half. It's over 100 countries, well over half of UN member states have recognized Palestine as a country. However, if you recognize Palestine as a country, which of course I think is a good thing, you have to recognize the government, which, for better or for worse, they recognize the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, as the government of Palestine. If you are a diplomat, if you run a government and you're supporting a people who have a legal representative, you're not going to just criticize how awful their government is. Obviously, everyone knows how bad the Palestinian Authority is and Abbas is. But again, this is one of these complicated situations. When you're a state, you have to deal with that situation. Even right. Hamas, despite their many criticisms of the PA, have to work with the PA at times. So yes, China's position is circumscribed by international law. Finally, this gets to and one other issue on Hamas. There have been so many reports, ironically, in the Israeli media condemning China for giving weapons to Hamas. Now, China publicly has not said that it has given weapons to Hamas, but there have been many videos and evidence posted online where you can see that Hamas is using Chinese weapons. So how they get those Chinese weapons, whether they get them through a third party, we don't really know. But the point is that Hamas is using Iranian weapons, Chinese weapons, is also using Russian weapons. Okay, finally, this gets to the most tricky issue about Israel. So yeah, China and Israel have relations. As you mentioned, China is one of the leading trade partners of Israel and of all of the other countries in the region. China is the largest trading partner of Iran. It's one of the largest trading partners of most countries, including Saudi Arabia, most of the Gulf monarchies, Turkey. It was also a major trading partner of Syria. So again, China wants to have good relations with everyone. And for better or for worse, Israel is a recognized state at the United Nations. Now, I think, and I think you probably agree, Israel should be kicked out of the United Nations, especially now that they're attacking the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and all this. It's insane. They're attacking UNRWA, the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians. They should be kicked out. But they exist. They're a member state. And China's position is respect for international law. If you read, in fact, the statements published by BRICS and the statements, for instance, published by China and Russia, they're bilateral statements, they constantly say, which is a jab at the West, that instead of talking about a so-called rules-based international order, their rhetoric is we must defend the international law-based system with its core in the United Nations. So for better or for worse, that system exists. So yes, China has relations with Israel. It trades with Israel. But as you also mentioned, behind the scenes, those relations are very tense. The Israeli media is constantly attacking Israel. The Chinese media is constantly criticizing Israel. The Israeli media is constantly attacking China. I meant to say the Israeli media constantly condemns China, and the Chinese media constantly condemns Israel and is very pro-Palestinian. In fact, of course, this is anecdotal, but I've been living in China for about a year and a half, and because I'm doing a PhD, I know a lot of different professors and academics who are very influential, who are advisors for the government and foreign ministry. Everyone I've met, everyone is pro-Palestinian without an exception. I mean, Palestine is one of those issues in China where it's not in any way a controversy. Everyone supports Palestine. There are other issues where people debate on, right? Like Europe, even Russia, there are debates about Russia, but Palestine is one thing that it's basically unanimous. You can see Palestinian flags. It's not uncommon to see them even in people's windows. Like there's a lot of sympathy, but because China has a perspective, for better or for worse, which is based on international law, they're very wary about being seen as violating international law because they want to uphold it. So given that Israel is a recognized state, given that Palestine they officially recognize as a state, they have to deal within that framework.
So I just want to be clear, Ben, because I don't want to be taken to be an endorser of the responsibility to protect. I'm, very critical of the RP2 and R2P. I think this is an acronym, but in any event, as people who watch my program will know, I believe the United States. I think it's obvious that the United States and other Western states cynically employ this doctrine, the responsibility to protect, to achieve their own nefarious geopolitical objectives, in a word, hegemony. I would say, however, and we don't need to debate this, I just want to be clear about my position, that there is an exception to the rule of non-interference where there has been a judgment by the ICJ that it is plausible that a state is committing genocide, because then Article 1 of the Genocide Convention is triggered. So that's my position. I think there's a narrow exception in this particular case that would apply. But I certainly
agree with you. I agree with
Yeah,
you. I'm just saying that from the perspective, if you're a government, right, it's very
yeah,
complicated because if you establish there's a precedent after spending decades criticizing R2P as China has, that's why, again, I mean, I'm saying I understand their perspective, but I agree with you. And this is why the Yemeni resistance, which is the de facto government of Yemen, they have actually, I think, very cleverly used the discourse of R2P saying we must intervene to stop the genocide in Gaza. So kind of turning the
absolutely.
West's own rhetoric against it. It's very clever.
Absolutely. So I want to talk to you a bit about the Belt and Road Initiative and how that factors into all of this. In September of 2023, Joe Biden announced something called the Economic Corridor Initiative, which will pass from India to West Asia and reach Europe via the port of Haifa. Not surprisingly, given Haifa's role in all of this, Israel has apparently signed on enthusiastically to this initiative. And I understand it to be more or less a competitor of the Belt and Road Initiative. How do you think the Belt and Road Initiative is playing into or affecting, if at all, China's policy towards Israel and Palestine?
It's not a significant factor. As you mentioned, the US has tried to create alternatives. In particular, the idea is to create a trade route going from India to the northwest and then going through the Persian Gulf monarchies, through Israel, eventually into Europe. That's a US strategy to try to integrate economically the region and exclude mainland China. But I mean, when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, we're talking about the majority of countries on Earth have signed on to the BRI, and the infrastructure of the BRI is mostly located in East Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa. Of course, West Asia is part of it, but within West Asia, the position of Israel, Palestine is not a key strategic part of it. But of course, this again gets to one of these thorny issues, which is that, China has taken the position that these states exist according to international law. We recognize them. We're going to trade with them. We're not going to interfere in their internal affairs. So I know you wanted to talk about Syria as well. This is very similar, where China had been very supportive of the Syrian government, but also now that there's a new government, I mean, they will deal with whoever it is, right? So this is China's position of non-interference. But China's position is also that in order to weaken US-led hegemony, you have to engage with these countries that are not the US, essentially, right? And so there was a lot of debate about this on BRICS when Saudi Arabia and the UAE were invited to join BRICS. There are a lot of people who are angry about that. But at the same time, if you think about it from the perspective of China, Russia, the BRICS countries, if you have these countries that have been firmly in the US camp for decades, if you can pull them a little bit more toward a non-aligned position, so at least they try to stay neutral in these conflicts, that does end up helping to weaken US-led hegemony, right? US-led imperialism. So we now see, for instance, that Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who have played horrible roles in the region, obviously, supporting the overthrow of the Syrian government, helping to normalize with Israel. The UAE has already recognized Israel, abandoning the Palestinians. Obviously, for decades, these countries have played very bad roles. But if you're a diplomat and you do want to weaken US-led imperialism and US hegemony, you have to sometimes engage in this kind of complex diplomacy where you broker peace talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which was actually a significant blow to the US project of trying to divide the region. And ironically, Saudi Arabia has, despite the fact that, again, it's completely abandoned the Palestinians, there's talks that Saudi Arabia will still recognize Israel with the ongoing Gaza genocide. Despite all of that, Iran and Saudi Arabia they have better relations now than they've had in decades, which is good for Iran because it divides the forces in the region that are trying to overthrow the Iranian government. So again, China's position is not I mean, there are a lot of people who would like China to be like this knight that swoops in and supports all of the revolutionary movements, but that's not how China has ever operated. It has a strict ideological position of non-interference. And in the case of Belt and Road, the idea that China had is that in 2009, when in the first Obama administration, when Hillary Clinton came in the State Department, they created a policy of the pivot to Asia, which was a recognition that China was becoming the world's largest economy. It has been since 2017, when GDP is measured at purchasing power parity, and China is still growing very, very healthily. It has become a major technological power, and the US could see that China is going to be a major power in the world. The pivot to Asia was about trying to surround China, to weaken China, to eventually destabilize the government. This is bipartisan, of course. It escalated massively under Trump and has continued escalating under Biden. The Obama administration initially had this pivot to Asia policy, and that's why in 2013, China launched the Belt and Road. It was a recognition that the US was going to move toward economic decoupling and isolation of China. So China said, we need to develop an alternative economic infrastructure so China could weaken its dependency on the US, because essentially for the past 40 years or so, the economic model was that China would move up the value chain of industrial production to industrialize the country, and it would create all of these consumer goods and technologies that would be exported largely to the Western consumer markets, to the US, to Europe. And now that the US, and to a lesser extent Europe, is trying to decouple economically and putting massive tariffs on China and sanctioning Chinese companies, China recognized a decade ago, they recognized they needed to diversify their trade with countries in the global south, other parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America. And they built Belt and Road as the physical infrastructure that would be needed to diversify that trade, to economically integrate. And part of that also includes improving their political relations, their diplomacy with these kinds of countries that in the region have been pretty nefarious, but geopolitically, they're playing a more complex role. Turkey is another example, right? So yeah. Erdogan has this rhetoric of supporting our brothers in Palestine while he continues giving oil to Israel, helping the Israeli war machine carry out genocide, while he has this public rhetoric that's the exact opposite. And yet Turkey also is constantly playing both sides, trying to join BRICS. It's a member of NATO. These are complex geopolitical games that are happening. And China's position is, we want to weaken US hegemony as much as we can, which means that we need to improve our relations with some of these kind of nefarious actors in the region. But again, China's position is very clear. They've made it clear. They have always supported the Palestinians. They've been a huge support for Iran. They had previously been a supporter of Syria, but they're not going to interfere in internal affairs of foreign countries, and certainly not going to send troops in order to prop up governments that are their allies. When a new government comes to power, they'll do what they can to try to have good relations with them. One quick final point. The irony is that you have in Argentina, Javier Milei, a far-right maniac, a self-declared anarcho-capitalist, who said when he was running for president, he said, our geopolitical orientation is with the United States and Israel. He said, we will not do trade with communists, vowing that he would not trade with China and also Russia. He apparently thinks Russia is still communist. At his inauguration, Zelensky was at his inauguration and they hugged each other. He's one of the few leaders in Latin America who supported Ukraine in this proxy war. But what's so funny is, despite all of that, despite being a loyal US puppet, Milei did an interview a few weeks ago in which he was asked by a journalist who said, you promised you would cut off all relations with China, but you went to China, you asked for China to bail you out, to give you a loan, and now you're expanding trade with China. And what did Milei say? He said, I was wrong about China. Our relations with China are great. It's amazing. They don't interfere. They don't tell us anything. They have no criticisms or anything. All they want to do is have equal relations. As long as we don't interfere in what they do, they won't interfere in what we do, and we trade. And that's fine. So this is China's position, for better or for worse. because what China is trying to do is literally, I mean, I'm not being hyperbolic. China is literally trying to create a new international infrastructure that is the opposite of what the US has built up over the past century, which is that the US has created an international financial system with its currency at the heart, with its financial systems that it controls at the heart of that system. The US helped to create the UN in a particular way that gave the US and France and the UK veto power, with power concentrated in the Security Council. The US created NATO with it at the heart, the Organization of American States based in Washington. China is trying to create an entirely different global order that is truly multilateral and multipolar, that is based on non-interference, for better or for worse. So it's completely different.
So I do want to talk to you next about Syria, but I just want to ask you about one narrow aspect of this vis-a-vis China, what's happening in Syria, because I want to really focus in the latter part of our discussion on Iran. And the question I have for you about Syria is this, Ben. It's been widely reported that in the forces of this terrorist entity, HTS, are a significant number of, I'm going to call them mercenaries. One might disagree, I guess, but mercenaries from Xinjiang, Uyghur fighters, who have now been trained and armed by Turkey and the United States in all probability. And in an article that was just published in the Asia Times, Andrei Korybko argued that this development could come back to haunt China. And he notes that members of the group just released a video from Syria calling for militant jihad against China. Now, I pause to note that if it had been a declaration of militant jihad against the United States would probably be bombing the bejesus out of Syria to an even greater extent than it is now, in an effort to wipe out these jihadists. But China seems to have done very little about this, and perhaps there's not much it can do. But I'm curious, from your perspective, being in China, does this seem to be an issue that is preoccupying the Chinese? And if so, how is this impacting their relations with Turkey, who has been arming and funding these lunatics?
This has been a major diplomatic issue between China and Turkey for years now, because Turkey has, at the very least, you could say, at the very least, allowed some of these separatist extremist forces to live and operate freely in Turkey. Most of them are based there, or they're based in Virginia, near CIA headquarters, right? And so essentially, for people who don't know, the brief of it is that for decades after the triumph of the Chinese Revolution in 1949, the US, in particular the CIA, have supported separatist movements inside China to try to weaken and break up China. They did the same thing in the former Soviet Union and in the Russian Federation, in Chechnya. And so, for instance, in Tibet, for decades, the CIA was arming and training and funding these extremists trying to wage armed struggle against the Chinese government to overthrow the government, or at the very least to break off Tibet. And famously, the Dalai Lama was funded by the CIA for many years, and probably still is, although we don't know publicly. We have documents and reports from mainstream outlets like the AP and the New York Times admitting that. And then, of course, we saw that there was an attempt in Hong Kong by these US-backed forces to have violent riots to try to destabilize the authorities there and basically try to break away from the People's Republic of China. Hong Kong was formerly a British colony until 1997. Macau was formerly a Portuguese colony. So we essentially, these are attempts to try to break up China. And then, of course, there's the issue of Taiwan, which has been part of China for centuries, hundreds of years, well before the United States ever existed or Canada ever existed. Taiwan has been part of China. And yet, and also when the People's Republic of China officially normalized diplomatic relations with the United States, that was officially in 1979. It started in 1972 under Nixon. They signed the first communique, and the second communique was in 79. And the U.S. recognized that there's one China, the one China policy. Almost every single country on earth recognizes that there's only one China, and Taiwan is part of China. There are 12 countries which together have a combined population which is like 1%, less than 1% of the global population. They're tiny countries like Guatemala, Paraguay, Haiti, a few Pacific Island nations are the only countries that refuse to recognize the one China policy. But and that's because of U.S. pressure. Because Haiti unfortunately has been governed by a series of U.S. puppet regimes, and Guatemala as well. So the point is that the U.S. technically recognizes, as part of the foundational agreement upon which U.S.-China relations are based, that there's one China policy. However, the U.S. has continued supporting separatists in Taiwan, selling weapons to Taiwanese authorities, despite the fact that in 1982, in the third communique, the U.S. agreed with China that it would, over time, stop selling weapons to Taiwan, and it would not give offensive weapons, but the U.S. has been violating that agreement. Okay, so now we get to the issue of Xinjiang. I mentioned Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan. These are attempts to break up China. Xinjiang is a large province in the western part of China, and this is very important for China for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's been part of China, again, for hundreds of years before the U.S. existed as a country, and it's very important for national security purposes because the U.S. would love to have a big military base right on China's border, like a big Ukraine on Russia's border. It's very important for energy resources because Xinjiang has a lot of natural resources and energy, and China is very dependent on importing oil. It's by far the world's largest importer of oil from the Persian Gulf, from Venezuela, from Iran. So it's a security problem for China. You need energy, and so what the U.S. has been trying to do for decades, this is not new, is support separatist extremist groups in Xinjiang who have carried out violent attacks against Chinese security forces. And one of these groups was recently delisted as a terrorist organization by the U.S., which of course means that the U.S. can legally, they don't need legal permission, they can legally give weapons to these armed groups. When I say legally, I mean according to U.S. law. But we know that the CIA constantly violates U.S. law. They say they're not supposed to operate domestically. They do. They say they're not supposed to spread propaganda domestically. They do. Anyway, the point is that previously there was a group that was called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, which rebranded like Syrian Al-Qaeda. Jabhat al-Nusra rebranded as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And now the U.S. is going to delist them as a terrorist organization, which paves the way for the U.S. giving support to them. The U.K. is already sending them 50 million pounds of aid, which is material support for terrorism. But in the case of ETIM, this group rebranded as the TIP, which is the Turkestan Islamic Party, which is affiliated with Al-Qaeda. They're proud of that. Thus far, they haven't rebranded to such a degree that they've distanced themselves from Al-Qaeda. Maybe the U.S. can pressure them to do that as well, like they did in Syria. But the point is that under the Trump administration, the Pompeo State Department officially delisted this group and said they don't exist. They said there's no evidence this group exists. Well, here we have a lot of evidence. We have videos published by the Turkestan Islamic Party, allied with Al-Qaeda, in Syria, declaring war on China, saying that they're going to have a war to break off what they call East Turkestan, which is Western China, which is Xinjiang, which has been part of China for hundreds of years. So in terms of China's perspective on this, obviously they're very unhappy about this. But at the same time, I don't think we shouldn't overestimate the threat that it poses. This group is very small. And yeah, the U.S. can give them weapons, but again, they're very tiny and they're operating outside of China. And in the case of Syria, this is quite far from China. How would they even get to China? There are people saying that maybe like Turkey could give them passports, but from the Turkish government's perspective, it's also complicated because Turkey and China have also deep trading relations. Turkey is very wary. They don't want to anger China because their trade relations with China are so important. And Turkey, again, is playing this complicated geopolitical game where it's allied with Israel and Syria, and objectively, Erdogan and Netanyahu worked together to overthrow the Syrian government. And now both Turkey and Israel are colonizing Syrian territory with help from the U.S., of course. But at the same time, Turkey, is trying to join BRICS. It's constantly playing different sides. Turkey has massively increased its trade with Russia. It has not imposed sanctions on Russia. Turkey's become one of like these third countries that where the Western sanctions on Russia have meant that like exports have been rerouted. So instead of previously a country in like companies in Europe, in Western Europe would want to send something to Russia. Now what they do is they export to Turkey, and then Turkey exports it to Russia. Or they export it to Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan exports it to Russia. Or to Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan exports it to Russia. So Turkey's playing this very complex game. No one can trust Turkey. It's actually very dangerous for Turkey because no one trusts Turkey. Russia doesn't trust Turkey. The West doesn't trust Turkey. China doesn't trust Turkey. But this is the kind of game they're playing. And of course, when it comes to the Turkish government and the Turkish intelligence agency, MIT, it's also complicated. Turkey was the original deep state, right? That term came from looking at the Turkish deep state and the role of the spy agency, the MIT. And there are allegations that the MIT has been supporting these groups like the TIP, the Turkestan Islamic Party, these extremist separatists from China. Whereas, honestly, even though I have no sympathy for Erdogan, I don't think Erdogan is intentionally allowing the Turkish government to support these groups because he doesn't want to anger China. So I think China is not. They are concerned about Syria being a very unstable country now, like Libya, that was destroyed by NATO in 2011. Libya had been the most prosperous country in Africa. Now it's a failed state, still with an ongoing civil war. China is concerned about Syria being a hotbed for these extremist groups to try to operate there and then move throughout the region like Afghanistan was historically. But Afghanistan is on China's border. Syria is not. And these groups can publish videos, but it's very difficult for them to actually try to do something in China. But again, yeah, this is something that China's security services are concerned about. And this has been an issue in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, which is, BRICS is mostly seeking to create an alternative economic infrastructure in the world. BRICS technically, officially, they say they have three purposes. They have economic and trade, politics and diplomacy, and cultural exchange. They say those are the three things they discuss, but mostly it's about building economic alternatives for countries to seek alternatives to the dollar and the US controlled financial system. That's the main goal of BRICS, essentially. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a security organization. It was originally founded by China, Russia, and Central Asian nations as a way to combat extremist groups, especially in the 2000s with many of these Islamist extremist forces carrying out attacks. I mentioned Chechnya. This was a big issue for Russia. So that's the SCO had its origins in that. And since then, the SCO has expanded. India and Pakistan are members, which is very interesting because they're obviously at each other's throats. Iran has become a full member of the SCO. Syria had been an observer in the SCO, but we'll see what happens there. Belarus is trying to join. So this is the kind of regional security organization, and they're probably going to work together to combat these kinds of groups. But, again, China's position is that this is an issue for Syrians to resolve, that we're not going to interfere in Syria's internal affairs. Whatever the new government is, for better or for worse, we will work with them if they're willing to work with us, as long as they don't support these groups that are trying to destabilize China. If the Syrian government, the new Syrian government, which is run by rebranded Al-Qaeda, if they openly support these groups in Xinjiang, of course, China will not have relations with them. So, But if they are pragmatic, China is also pragmatic.
So finally, Ben, let's talk about Iran. Whatever the Uyghur jihadist threat coming from Syria may or may not be, I'm sure the Chinese government is very concerned about the possibility of a full-blown war between the United States, Britain, and Israel on the one side and Iran on the other. As I mentioned at the outset, 15% of China's oil is currently imported from Iran, another 15% from Saudi Arabia. If I was in, they don't need any advice from me, but if I was an advisor of the Chinese government, I would be saying very loudly that you want to ensure to the maximum possible degree that your oil imports are coming from governments that are not beholden to the United States. You don't want your economy, the largest economy in the world now, on a purchasing power parity basis, to be dependent upon suppliers who are effectively vassals of Washington. And one such government that's not a vassal of Washington, providing a lot of oil, is Iran. So I'm going to ask you to look at your crystal ball for a moment here. And what is your best judgment about how Iran is likely to respond if, in fact, all these war hawks, these China hawks that have been inserted into the cabinet of the incoming Trump administration prevail upon Trump? And maybe he doesn't even need to be convinced because he's so radically Zionist in his outlook himself, to launch a war on Iran, one of the few remaining governments in that part of the world that actually are not beholden to the U.S. Do you think that China might be forced at that stage to become more interventionist? And if so, how would it do so?
China would not intervene. China would give weapons to Iran and provide some support, but it would definitely not intervene. China doesn't intervene. Like I said, China has not intervened in a military conflict since 1979, and they see that as a mistake today, if you ask. This was the one month war with Vietnam. A lot of people regret that. Again, China is very opposed to military intervention on principle, even in support of allies. The only circumstance in which they would have a war is over the situation in Taiwan. They don't want a war, but because according to international law, Taiwan is part of China. And if there is an attempt to break off Taiwan, then China would intervene, because they don't. Let me take that back. That's the wrong word. They don't see that as intervention because Taiwan is part of China. So for them, it's not intervention, right?
Yeah.
So there's no way, even in support of an ally like Iran. Now, I'll provide a little background. You mentioned the point of oil, which is very important, but it's not just oil. China and Iran have deep relations that go back decades. It's one of China's closest partners. And in 2021, China and Iran signed a very comprehensive 25-year strategic agreement that massively, includes every aspect of cooperation: trade, energy, infrastructure, security, everything. And essentially, it's funny because in 1997, the former U.S. imperial strategist and former U.S. national security advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski published this book, The Great Chessboard, in which he talked about plans for maintaining U.S. hegemony. And he said one of the biggest threats to U.S. hegemony would be what he called an anti-hegemonic alliance between China, Russia, and Iran, which is hilarious because he said in the 90s, the U.S. should do everything it can to prevent that from happening. It's happened. China, Russia, and Iran are very close partners. And so it's very interesting as well because of the unilateral illegal U.S. sanctions against Iran, which violate international law. China has continued doing a lot of trade with Iran, and they've also worked out a very interesting barter system where Iran has difficulty getting access to foreign currency because of the sanctions. So instead of using foreign currency, China will trade with Iran in return for oil. Or China will, for instance, China is helping to expand and modernize the main international airport in Tehran, and Iran is paying with oil. Which is interesting because, by the way, back during the first Cold War, the Soviet Union had similar agreements, like, for instance, with Cuba, because Cuba was under a U.S. blockade, it still is, and can't get access to foreign currencies. So they were doing barter. And they had a deal where the Soviet Union would trade with Cuba for Cuban sugar. And it was at a set price, regardless of market fluctuations. Of course, we have international commodity markets. The price of sugar can go up and down. The price of oil goes up and down. But you have these set deals that are essentially decommodified, and it's based on a set price, not based on market price, which is very interesting. It's often very advantageous for the commodity exporters because if the price of oil, goes down a lot, they still are at a set price, so they're actually making more money. And this was often what happened with Cuba. That in terms of trade. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, just because those kinds of deals also protect the parties to the contract from any market manipulations that are designed, of commodity prices, which does happen. It actually does happen, which could be quite injurious to the interests of one side or the other. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, absolutely. That's true. Like, for instance, one of the big reasons that after this new phase of the Ukraine war started, one of the big reasons that a lot of poor countries, especially in Africa, had food shortages, wheat shortages, it's not just because of the war, it's because of speculators in the commodity markets, especially in grains. There's a lot of grain market speculation. And when this new phase of the war happened in Ukraine in 2022, it wasn't like overnight suddenly there was a massive shortage of grains. It was that in response to this war, speculators massively pushed up the price of wheat and corn and millet and these other grains that are needed. So yeah, what you said is very important about maintaining macroeconomic stability, which can provide political stability. So China and Iran have a deep partnership that, especially for Iran, is fundamental. But also, as you said, for China, this is important for energy reasons. This is also, by the way, why China is at breakneck speed moving to renewable energy. Obviously, China is concerned about climate change, much more concerned than the US is. And China has been the world's leader in the green transition. China has installed more solar and wind power capacity than the rest of the world combined. And now it's actually nearly twice what the rest of the world has combined. So Part of that's because of climate change, but it's also a huge security problem because China is very afraid of the possibility of a US war where the US would pressure the Gulf monarchies to cut off trade to China, would potentially close the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of that oil is going to China. The US is the world's largest oil producer, so the US isn't very dependent on that oil, but China is. China is also very concerned about the possibility of the Malacca Strait being blocked off. So China, by massively investing in renewable energy domestically, it also means that it's more self-sufficient in case there's a conflict in the future. But getting back to your main question about Iran, I talked about the larger geopolitical situation.
Yeah.
China and Iran have deep security relations. So not just economic, but in terms of fighting against extremist groups, because of course, Iran is deeply concerned about Al-Qaeda, remnants of ISIS and these other extremist groups, because some of the main victims of these extremist groups, the Salafi jihadist militias, have been Shia Muslims, right? This is not talked about enough in the West. The main victims have been other Sunnis who don't agree with their extremist views and Shia. But the West says that they're the victims, which is a small minority of the actual deaths of, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And we now see that, the US and Israel are helping rebranded Al-Qaeda take power in Syria. So China and Iran have been collaborating against these extremist groups for a long time. And okay, so we get to the issue of Israel. I agree. I share your concern. The former U.S. general and NATO commander Wesley Clark famously said in an interview on Democracy Now!, he revealed that after 9/11, the U.S. military had plans to take out 7 countries in 5 years. It took them much more than 5 years. It took them 2 decades, but they did succeed in destabilizing and overthrowing 6 of those 7 governments, which those 7 countries were Iran, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, and Libya. And 6 of those have been destroyed or destabilized. So Iran is the last one. We all know that the US and Israel have been trying to overthrow the Iranian government for a long time. I think that is actually much more difficult than even Syria, because the Syrian state was basically destroyed after a decade of war. The sanctions on Syria completely suffocated the country. People in the Syrian army were getting paid $30 a month. There were massive shortages of oil and wheat, in no small part because the U.S. military was occupying Syria's oil and wheat fields. So they caused economic collapse in Syria, which in turn caused state collapse. And then all of Syria's allies were tied up. Russia was tied up in Ukraine. Hezbollah was tied up with the fight against Israel in South Lebanon. The same day that these, U.S.-backed and Israeli and Turkish-backed rebels linked to Al-Qaeda, the same day they launched their assault in Syria, was the same day that Israel signed its so-called its ceasefire with Lebanon, and then immediately Israel violated the ceasefire 100 times in 1 week, according to the UN. So it was about dividing all of those groups. The Telegraph newspaper reported that the U.S. military was preparing the so-called rebels in Syria. They told them to get ready to launch the assault, and then they gave them the orders to do it. Turkey did the same thing, according to France 24 reported that. So it was about isolating Syria from all of its allies. Iran's a bit different. Iran is a much bigger country, a very powerful military. Geographically, it's very difficult as well. I mean, it's basically surrounded by mountains that make it very difficult for some kind of ground assault. Now Israel, there are Israeli military officers on Twitter who are boasting that now they can launch airstrikes by going through Syria because they know that the Al-Qaeda light regime won't stop them. They'll go through Syria and then they say they'll go through Iraq. Iraq's not going to be a fan of that, but the Iraqi government is also very weak and occupied by the US. They argue they can launch airstrikes in Iran. Maybe they can. It's also very far. I don't know how they'll refuel. I mean, but the point is that it's much more difficult to wage a war on Iran. People can quote me now. I hope I'm not wrong, but I do not in any way see the possibility of the Iranian government falling. It is in a much better situation than Syria was in, but the US and Israel can cause severe damage to Iran. The US is going to put even more sanctions on Iran to try to suffocate the Iranian economy. They probably will try something crazy like bombing Iran even more. They've already done it. But I mean, they're limited in what they can do. In Syria is a very special case. It was surrounded by hostile countries with Turkey and its northern border and Jordan and its southern border. And the US used Jordan to send in, to train the so-called rebels, to send them into Syria. Turkey was allowing these Salafi jihadists from around the world to go into Turkey on the famous jihadi highway and then go south into Syria. Iran is very different. And again, China is going to make sure that it does provide support economically in terms of security to Iran, but it's not going to send troops or anything. So It's a very difficult situation, but it's very different.
So let us hope, Ben, that China is never required to decide how to respond to an attack upon Iran, because that would be, first and foremost, a complete disaster for the entire region of West Asia. In any event, it's been delightful to talk to you. I thank you very much for the generous time you've taken in speaking with me today, and I hope we can continue the conversation in the future, Ben, when the ultimate destiny of the region is known. We're about to find out exactly what Donald Trump's plans are, I suspect. But thank you again, and this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal on December 21st for Reason to Resist.